The gun was already drawn before Clayton Blackwell had finished walking through the door of the Dusty Creek Land Office, and the woman holding it had eyes like a winter storm, cold, certain, and entirely without mercy. "You take one more step toward that desk," Lillian Fairchild said, her voice steady as iron, "and I will put a hole in that fine hat of yours that no milliner in Texas can repair." Clayton stopped. He looked at the gun. He looked at the woman. He looked at the three men pressed flat against the back wall of the office, each of them pale as bleached bone, and he understood instantly that he had walked into something that had been simmering long before he arrived. He did not reach for his own weapon. He did not step back. He simply said, "I am not here for the desk." "Then what are you here for?" Lillian asked, and the pistol did not waver by so much as a fraction of an inch. "I was told," Clayton said carefully, "that you might need help." Something shifted in those storm-gray eyes. It was not softness. It was not relief. It was something sharper than both. It was the particular fury of a woman who had been told that very thing far too many times by far too many men who had absolutely no intention of giving it. "Help," she repeated, and the word came out like the sound of a match being struck. "Yes, ma'am. The last man who came here to help me tried to sign my land over to Chester Pratt's Cattle Company while I was standing right there in front of him. The man before that tried to take my horse." She tilted her head slightly. "The man before that tried to take considerably more than my horse." "I am sorry to hear it," Clayton said, and he meant it. He meant it so completely that something in the plain, unadorned weight of those words seemed to give her the first half-second of pause she had shown since he walked in. One of the three men along the back wall made a small, strangled sound. It was Chester Pratt's land agent, a man named Dahlin, and he was watching the stranger in the doorway with an expression that fell somewhere between hope and absolute terror. He had come with two hired men to convince Lillian Fairchild to sign away the water rights to the spring that ran through the eastern edge of her property. He had brought legal documents. He had brought intimidation. He had, at one point, brought what he believed was a very compelling speech about the natural order of things and a woman's place within it. The speech had not gone well. Lillian had listened to about 14 seconds of it before she produced the Colt single-action Army revolver that now kept three grown men pinned against a wall, and told Dahlin in plain, measured language that she had survived a drought, 2 cattle thieves, a flash flood, and one particularly ambitious rattlesnake this year alone, and she was not about to let a land agent from Fort Worth be the thing that broke her. That had been 20 minutes ago. Into this particular storm Clayton Blackwell had walked, having ridden 4 days from Abilene on the word of a man he trusted more than most, Judge Harlan Whitmore, who had written him a letter that said simply, "There is a woman in Dusty Creek, Texas, who is about to lose everything she has built because no one in that town has the spine to stand beside her. Her name is Lillian Fairchild. Go." He had gone. He had not expected her to be pointing a gun at him when he arrived. He supposed, on reflection, he should have. 3 weeks earlier, Judge Whitmore had sat across from Clayton in the narrow anteroom of a Wichita courthouse and laid out the situation with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years navigating the law on a frontier where the law was more suggestion than structure. "Chester Pratt," the judge said, "owns most of Crockett County by way of contract, coercion, and selective memory. He has been acquiring land and water rights along the Pecos tributary for 3 years. He is not a violent man by preference. He prefers paperwork to pistols, but the people he employs are not similarly restrained." "And the woman?" Clayton asked. "Her name is Lillian Fairchild. She is 26 years old. She inherited the Fairchild Ranch from her father, who died of fever 18 months ago. Before that, she worked the ranch alongside him for 6 years after her mother passed. She has 40 head of cattle, a reliable spring, and about 900 acres of good grazing land that Chester Pratt wants very badly because it sits between 2 parcels he already owns, and without it, he cannot complete the water access he needs to run cattle at scale." "Has she had legal representation?" "She had a lawyer," the judge said. He was quietly paid a sum that made him reconsider his professional obligations. Clayton was quiet for a moment. "You said she was impossible to manage." The judge allowed himself a small smile. "That is what the people trying to manage her say. What I said was that she has a way of making it very clear, very quickly, that she will not be handled. She sent the county sheriff back to town without his hat last month after he suggested she might consider selling before things became unpleasant. She filed 3 legal challenges against Pratt's previous land acquisitions on behalf of her neighbors, despite having no legal training and no reason to do it beyond the fact that she knew it was right. The man Pratt sent to discuss terms with her last September left the conversation without 2 of his shirt buttons and a considerable amount of his dignity. And you think she needs a lawyer? I think she needs someone who is not there to manage her," the judge said. "I think those are different things. And I think you, Clayton, are one of the very few people I have ever met who actually understands the difference." So Clayton had ridden south through the dust and the heat with a leather satchel full of legal documents, a working knowledge of Texas property law, and zero illusions about what he was walking into. He had not, it must be said, expected to arrive quite so literally in the middle of it. "Those men," he said, still standing in the doorway, still watching Lillian with the careful attention of a man who understood that the wrong word here would be the last word he got to say. "Are they Pratt's people? Dahlin is his land agent. The other 2 came along to look imposing. Are you planning to keep them there all day?" "I am planning," Lillian said, "to keep them there until they agree to walk out of this office and ride back to Fort Worth without taking anything of mine with them." "Have they agreed yet?" Dahlin made a sound. "Miss Fairchild." "That is not agreement," Lillian said, not looking at him. Clayton crossed the threshold. He moved slowly and with the deliberate calm of a man who is making absolutely certain every movement is visible and intentional. He set his satchel down on the nearest chair. He unbuttoned his coat very carefully to show that his own weapon was holstered and his hands were not moving toward it. "I am a lawyer," he said. "My name is Clayton Blackwell. Judge Harlan Whitmore sent me. I have documented evidence of procedural fraud in 3 of Pratt's previous land acquisitions in this county, and I have the legal standing to bring it before a federal magistrate. If Mr. Dahlin and his associates leave now, without those documents they came for, and without Miss Fairchild's signature on anything, I will consider that the gentlemanly resolution to what has been a deeply unfortunate morning." There was a long silence. "And if we do not?" Dahlin asked. "Then I file everything I have with the federal court in Austin, and Mr. Pratt spends the next 18 months explaining his land acquisition methods to people who have considerably less patience than Miss Fairchild." Another silence. Dahlin looked at the gun, he looked at the lawyer. He looked at the 2 men beside him, who looked back at him with the universal expression of hired muscle that has decided the pay is no longer worth it. "We will go," Dahlin said. Lillian did not lower the pistol until they were out the door, and she could hear the sound of 3 horses moving away down the main street of Dusty Creek at a pace that suggested genuine enthusiasm for departure. Then she lowered it. Then she set it on the desk. Then she turned and looked at Clayton Blackwell for the first time without a gun between them, and what she saw was a man of about 32, lean and weathered in the way of someone who spent more time outdoors than indoors, with dark eyes and a steady expression and dust on his boots from a very long ride. "You said Judge Whitmore sent you," she said. "He did. Why?" "Because he thought you needed someone on your side who actually knew the law." "I know the law," she said. It was not bragging. It was a statement of fact delivered with the flat certainty of someone who had spent the better part of 2 years educating herself by necessity. "You do," Clayton agreed. "That is clear. What you do not have is standing in a federal court and the documentation to back it up." Lillian studied him for a long moment. There was something in the way she did it that reminded Clayton of the way experienced horse traders assessed a new animal, not unkindly, but with the full weight of hard-won experience behind every observation. "Who are you?" she asked. Not his name. She had his name. She meant, "Who are you really, and why are you here, and what is it that you want that you have not said yet?" "I was a lawyer in Kansas City," he said. "Before that I was a soldier. Before that I was a ranch hand in Missouri. I came to Texas because Judge Whitmore asked me to and because the work sounded like it mattered." "That is not who you are," she said. "That is what you have done." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something more considered than that. "Fair point," he said. The town of Dusty Creek, Texas, sat in the southwestern corner of Crockett County like something that had been placed there in a moment of optimism and then slightly forgotten. It had a main street, a general store, a saloon, a church, a land office, a livery stable, and approximately 400 people trying to build something durable out of a landscape that frequently had other ideas. The drought of 1882 had hit Crockett County hard. Wells that had served families for a decade went dry. Ranchers who had built carefully over years found themselves forced to sell or consolidate. It was into this thinning of the herd, as it were, that Chester Pratt had moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that other people's desperation was, if you had enough capital and patience, an opportunity. Lillian Fairchild had understood what Pratt was doing before most of her neighbors did. She had seen the pattern in the deeds that were being quietly filed in the county records. She had read every single one of them, traveling to the county seat and spending 2 full days going through the books while the clerk watched her with undisguised bewilderment, because women did not do that, and certainly not young women with sun-dark hands and a directness of gaze that made most men slightly uncomfortable. She had brought her findings back to her neighbors. She had told them what she saw. Some had listened, some had not. Several had sold before she could reach them, caught in the vice of debt and dry pasture, but she had not sold, she had held. Her father, Thomas Fairchild, had come to Texas in 1869 with 2 mules, a wagon, and a level of determination that his daughter had inherited in full measure. He had built the ranch from nothing over 13 years, and when he died of the fever that swept through the county in the winter of 1881, he had left it to Lillian not because she was his only child. He had a son, her brother David, who had gone east for schooling and married a woman from Philadelphia and found that he preferred it there, but because she was the one who had stayed. The one who understood every acre of it, every fence line, every mood of the spring that ran cold and clear even through the worst of the drought. She had not sold because it was hers in a way that went deeper than the deed. Clayton spent his first day in Dusty Creek at the land office, reviewing the documents Dahlin had brought and cross-referencing them with the copies Judge Whitmore had sent him. What he found confirmed what the judge had suspected. The contract Dahlin had been trying to get Lillian to sign contained a clause buried in the middle of 7 paragraphs of dense legal language that would have transferred not just the water rights to the spring but a 60-foot easement around it, effectively giving Pratt's cattle access to the entire eastern section of her property and making the western section unworkable without crossing that easement. It was elegant, as traps went. Which made it no less a trap. Lillian sat across from him at the desk in the land office, which the clerk had vacated with obvious relief after the morning's events, and read everything he put in front of her. She read carefully and she asked precise questions. He answered them without condescension, which she noticed. "The fraud documentation," she said. "The 3 previous acquisitions you mentioned to Dahlin." The Hendricks parcel was purchased after Pratt's agent told the family there was a federal survey error that made their title invalid. There was no survey error. He fabricated it. I have the original survey records from the Federal Land Office in Austin. The Kavanaugh land, Mrs. Kavanaugh was told the drought had triggered an unpaid water assessment that would result in a lien against her property. No such assessment existed. Her land was purchased for 1/3 of its value the following week. Lillian's expression was controlled, but something moved behind it, the dark, specific anger of someone who knew these families, who had probably warned them, who had watched the trap close anyway. And the Martinez property. That one is more complicated. The Martinezes were given an offer they did not want to take, and when they refused, their fencing was cut in 3 places over 2 weeks, their cattle strayed, and they were unable to meet a legitimate bank payment as a result. He paused. I cannot prove Pratt ordered the fence cutting, but I can prove the timeline and make it look extremely suggestive in front of a federal judge. Lillian was quiet for a moment. The Martinezes lost their land. Yes, they are living in town now. Elena Martinez is taking in laundry. Clayton looked at her. I know, he said quietly. I know it is too late for them, but it does not have to be too late for others. She looked at him. It was that same assessing look, the one that seemed to go all the way through to the back of whatever it found. Why does this matter to you? She asked. You rode 4 days to be here. You are not from Texas. You do not know these people. Because it is wrong, he said. And again, it was the plainness of it that struck her, not a speech, not a practiced sentiment, just a statement of simple fact from a man who appeared to find it genuinely sufficient. That has not generally been enough reason for people to come, she said. I know, he met her eyes. I am sorry it took this long. Dusty Creek's reaction to Clayton Blackwell's arrival was layered and complicated in the way that small-town reactions always are. The saloon had the story within 6 hours of his arrival. The general store had the expanded version, including several details that had been invented for texture, within 10. By the following morning, the version circulating involved a considerably more dramatic confrontation at the land office, and an unspecified romantic entanglement that had not yet occurred, but which the town appeared to be collectively anticipating with the particular enthusiasm of people who do not have enough theater. Hester Kane, who ran the boarding house where Clayton had taken a room, had known Lillian since Lillian was 12 years old. She was 63, built like a fence post with opinions, and she came to find Clayton at breakfast on his second morning with the air of a woman conducting an interview she had every intention of controlling. You are staying, she said. It was not a question. At least until the legal filings are complete, he said. Possibly longer if there are challenges. She poured his coffee with the decisive authority of someone who had learned that actions communicated considerably more than words. She is not easy. I do not imagine she is. She will argue with you. She will challenge everything you suggest. She will refuse help that she clearly needs and then find a way to achieve it alone just to prove she can. Clayton wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. She sounds like someone who has been let down enough times that she stopped waiting for people to come through. Hester was quiet for a moment. Her father was a good man. Quiet, strong. He raised her to think for herself after her mother died because there was no one else to do it. She was 16 when Margaret Fairchild passed. She set the coffee pot down. The town has not always known what to do with her. A woman who runs her own ranch and files legal challenges and reads county deed books and does not smile at men just because they expect it. She sounds, Clayton said, like exactly what she is. Hester looked at him for a long moment. You are not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Someone who was going to try to solve her. He almost smiled. She does not need solving. No, Hester agreed. She does not. She picked up the coffee pot and headed back toward the kitchen. She needs someone who knows that. He found Lillian that afternoon at the eastern fence line of her property, where she was riding the boundary on a gray horse that moved with the easy, ground-covering stride of an animal that had been trained well over a long time. She did not look surprised to see him, which suggested either that she had seen him coming or that she made it a policy never to look surprised by anything. I thought you were reviewing the filings, she said. I finished reviewing them. I need to see the spring. She looked at him. Why? Because the legal description in the original Fairchild deed uses the spring as a natural boundary marker. If Pratt's easement claim goes to court, I need to be able to testify to its physical position relative to the property line. I need to have seen it. This was true. It was also true that he had wanted to see the land her land in the way that made it real rather than abstract. The documents told him the legal story. He wanted the full one. She turned the horse without further comment, and he fell in beside her on the bay gelding the livery had rented him, and they rode east through the dry grass September of the Texas afternoon. The spring was everything the documents suggested, and then more. It emerged from a limestone shelf about halfway up a low rise, running cold and quick through a channel that had worn itself over centuries into the rock, feeding a pool that stayed at a constant level regardless of what the weather above ground was doing. The grass around it was green in a way that the rest of the landscape had forgotten during the drought. A cluster of cottonwoods stood along its bank, their leaves turned to the particular dusty gold that September in Texas produces. Lillian dismounted and let her horse drink, and Clayton did the same, and for a while neither of them said anything, which turned out not to be uncomfortable. "He wants this very badly," Clayton said at last. "Yes, not just for the water. This spring feeds into the tributary that runs through the Hendricks parcel and the Kavanaugh land, both of which he now owns. If he controls this spring, he controls the water supply for the entire eastern section of the county." "I know," Lillian said. She was standing at the edge of the pool, looking down into it. "I worked it out about 8 months ago. That is when I started reading the county records. And you told your neighbors." "I told everyone I could reach." "The Hendrickses had already signed. The Kavanaughs, I thought I had more time." She stopped. There was something tightly controlled in her expression that he recognized as the particular way people hold grief when they have not been able to afford to let it out yet. "You did everything you could," he said. "I did not do enough." "That is not the same as not doing enough. Sometimes the only thing that was possible was not enough, and that is not a failure of effort." She looked at him then, sharply, as if checking to see if he was saying something easy that sounded meaningful. His expression held. "He meant it. My father used to say something like that," she said after a moment. Her voice was slightly different when she said it, not softer exactly, but as if a different layer of her had briefly surfaced. "He sounds like he was a good man. He was the best man I ever knew." She looked back at the water. "He would have been glad someone came." "I am glad I came," Clayton said, and then immediately wondered if it was too much, too soon, too presumptuous. But she did not look away from the water, and she did not say anything to dismiss it. And the afternoon held still around them for a moment that felt like more than just the sum of its parts. They rode back in the last of the afternoon light, side by side and mostly quiet, and it was a different kind of quiet than the careful professional distance of the morning. It was the quiet of two people who have begun, tentatively and without quite acknowledging it, to be in the same place rather than just occupying the same space. Chester Pratt arrived in Dusty Creek on a Thursday, 2 weeks into Clayton's stay, and he arrived with the particular confidence of a man who has never been seriously inconvenienced. He was 51 years old, well-fed and well-dressed in the way of someone who has not done physical labor in a very long time. He had silver-gray hair and a manner of speaking that fell somewhere between courthouse and pulpit, authoritative, measured, and deeply accustomed to being listened to. He came to the boarding house and asked for Clayton Blackwell, and Hester Kane brought Clayton downstairs with an expression that communicated, clearly and without words, that she was watching. "Mr. Blackwell," Pratt said, "I think we should talk." They sat in Hester's front parlor, which was full of lace and chinaware, and gave the impression of being somehow less comfortable than it looked, and Chester Pratt said, with a pleasant directness that Clayton recognized as the presentation of someone who has decided that charm is the cheaper option before switching to pressure, "I understand you have come to represent Miss Fairchild's interests." "I have come to help ensure that her legal rights are protected," Clayton said. "Which should be a concern of everyone in this county." "Of course." Pratt spread his hands in an expansive gesture. "I have nothing but respect for Miss Fairchild. She is a remarkable young woman, determined, capable. But I think she may not fully understand the economic realities of operating a small ranch in this county going forward. The drought has changed things." "It has," Clayton agreed. "For instance, I now understand far more clearly how properties were acquired during it." A brief pause, just long enough. "I hope you are not suggesting—" "I am not suggesting anything, Mr. Pratt. I have documented it." Clayton kept his voice pleasant. I have filed preliminary paperwork with the federal court in Austin, and I have sent a copy of the supporting documents to Judge Whitmore. The hearing date has been set for the 14th of November. This time, the pause was longer. That seems, Pratt said, and his voice had shifted slightly, still controlled, but with an edge now like a knife presented at an angle, like an aggressive response to what is a straightforward business matter. Fabricating a federal survey error is not a business matter, Clayton said. Neither is threatening a family's water supply to coerce a sale. I think you know that. Chester Pratt looked at Clayton Blackwell for a long moment with the calculating attention of a man reassessing a situation. Miss Fairchild, he said at last, is a difficult woman. She is a woman defending what is hers, Clayton said. I do not consider those the same thing. Pratt stood. He smoothed his coat. He put on the expression of a man who has decided to be gracious about something he has no intention of accepting. I look forward to seeing you in court, Mr. Blackwell. As do I, Clayton said, and stood, and held the parlor door open with a courtesy that contained within it something that was not courtesy at all. He told Lillian about the meeting that evening. She was at her kitchen table with a stack of documents in front of her, receipts, land records, handwritten notes in a precise, angular hand, and she looked up when he told her what Pratt had said. He called me difficult, she said. He called you impossible to manage, actually. I paraphrased. Something flickered in her expression. It moved fast, but he caught it. And what did you say? I said I had not come to manage you. The silence that followed had a particular quality to it. She looked at him steadily, and there was something in those gray eyes that he had not seen there before, not vulnerability exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that looked like the moment before a person decides to trust. Good, she said at last. Her voice was quiet. It was just one word, but it carried the weight of a much longer sentence. There were evenings after that became their own kind of ritual without either of them quite deciding to make them so. After the legal work was done for the day and the light was going, Clayton would sometimes find his way to the ranch house, and Lillian would have coffee on. She had an excellent coffee, strong and clear the way ranch coffee tended to be when someone cared about it, and they would sit at the kitchen table or sometimes on the porch and talk. They talked about the case at first, and then about other things, in the natural way that two intelligent people who have found each other interesting will expand outward from the practical into the personal. He told her about Kansas City, the law practice he had built there after the war years, the cases that had mattered and the ones that had paid the bills, and the growing sense, over a decade of it, that the frontier was where the actual law was being written, one contested parcel at a time, and he wanted to be where that was happening. She told him about her father's early years in Texas, the mule and wagon genesis of everything the ranch had become, the way Thomas Fairchild had known the land the way some men know music, not through formal study, but through a lifetime of attention. She told him about her brother David in Philadelphia with a complicated affection. She loved him, she missed him, and she had a way of talking about his choices that suggested she had come to understand them even if she had never fully shared them. He needed things I do not need, she said. A city, proximity. He is happy there. I think that matters more than having him here. Do you miss company? Clayton asked. He asked it carefully, the way you ask a question you genuinely want the answer to and are not entirely sure you have the right to. She was quiet for a moment. I miss having someone to talk to who talks back the way I need, she said. Most people either want to tell me what to do or they are afraid of me. I am not afraid of you. No, she said. You are not. She looked at him across the table. That is strange to me. Is it a problem? She almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile he had seen from her yet, and it transformed her face in a way that was not dramatic. She did not become some different, softer person, but added a dimension, the way a landscape looks different once the light shifts. I have not decided, she said. He started noticing things. The way she tilted her head slightly when she was thinking through a problem. The way her hands were very still when she was listening. The way she laughed, which she did rarely and without warning, a real laugh that sounded like she had not had enough occasions for it and was surprised each time one arrived. She started noticing things too. She noticed that he read in the evenings. He kept a book in his coat pocket, which she found absurd and then endearing. She noticed that he treated Hester Kane with genuine respect, not the patronizing variety that men sometimes offered to older women as a substitute for actually listening to them. She noticed that when he talked to her neighbors, and he did, methodically, building the evidentiary record of Pratt's conduct, he listened to them without rushing, without making them feel like information sources rather than people. She noticed the way he had said he had not come to manage her, and the way he had meant it, and the way he continued to mean it every day that followed. October settled into the county with a shift in the air that had nothing to do with a break in the heat and everything to do with the approach of something. The cottonwoods along the spring had gone fully gold. The trial date was 6 weeks out. Clayton was at the land office going through the final evidentiary organization when Lillian walked in with a look that he had not seen before, not the controlled fury of the gun-at-the-door moment, not the measured authority of their working sessions, but something with urgency in it. "There is a problem," she said. "Tell me." One of the witnesses, Elias Kavanaugh, he was going to testify about what Pratt's agent told him about the false water assessment. He received a visit this morning from 2 men who told him that his brother, who still lives in the county, might find ranching conditions significantly more difficult if Elias chose to speak in court. Clayton set down the documents. "Intimidation of a witness, which I cannot prove either because Elias is not going to report it. He cannot afford to put his brother at risk." "No, he cannot," he thought for a moment. "Are there others who might testify to similar things, the pattern of what was said to people before they sold, people who did not ultimately sell, who Pratt's agents approached but failed to persuade?" Lillian was already nodding. "The Vasquez family, they were approached twice. They refused twice. They are still here. If they will speak, I will ask them." She paused. "I know Rosa Vasquez. She will understand what it means to be asked." There was something in the way she said it, the particular understanding of someone who knew what it meant to be a woman asked to do a hard thing by someone who genuinely needed them to do it, rather than someone who simply expected it. "I will come with you," Clayton said. "You do not need." "I know I do not need to," he said, looking at her with the steady directness that she had begun to recognize as simply the way he looked at things he cared about. "I want to." They rode to the Vasquez ranch in the morning, and Rosa Vasquez listened to what Clayton explained with the careful attention of a woman who had been living with the awareness of Chester Pratt's ambitions since before most people in the county had named it. She was 44 years old, solid and deliberate, with the particular dignity of someone who has lived through considerable injustice without allowing it to strip her of her sense of who she was. She agreed to testify. She agreed because Lillian asked her, and because she understood that the only way the pattern would end was if enough people named it in a place where naming it carried legal consequence. "You are doing something important," Lillian told her in Spanish, which Clayton did not know she spoke until that moment. Rosa looked at her. "We have been waiting for someone to make it mean something," she said. Riding home, Clayton looked at Lillian. "Your Spanish is excellent," he said. "My father learned it from the family who taught him to ranch," she said. "He taught me. He said you cannot understand this land without understanding the people who were on it before." Something settled in him, a piece fitting into a larger picture. The way she read the county records, the way she had advocated for her neighbors, the way she spoke to Rosa Vasquez. There was a consistency to her that ran all the way through, and it was the consistency of someone whose principles were not decorative. "You are a remarkable person," he said, and it came out simpler and more direct than he had planned. She looked at him. The afternoon light made her face complicated. "You say things like they are just true," she said. "Because they are." She looked away, out across the dry grass and the enormous Texas sky. "Most people make a performance of it. I am not most people." "No," she said after a moment, "you are not." They rode the rest of the way in one of their silences, but it was a different kind, warmer, and full of something that had not been there when they started. November arrived, and with it, the particular crystalline cold of a Texas autumn, the kind that makes the sky look like someone has scrubbed it. Clayton was deep in trial preparation, working 12-hour days at the land office with stacks of documents organized by category and date, and Lillian was simultaneously managing the ranch. The fall cattle work did not stop because a legal battle was happening, and acting as an informal advisor and coordinator for the network of small ranchers who had understood what was at stake. It was during this period that something else happened, which was that the careful professional distance between them, already under considerable strain from weeks of evenings, and shared purpose, and two people who had been finding each other increasingly important, became impossible to maintain. It happened on a Wednesday evening when Clayton arrived at the ranch to go over the final witness list and found Lillian on the porch with a lantern and an expression that told him immediately something was wrong that was not about the case. "What happened?" he said. She held out a letter. He took it and read it in the lantern light. It was from her brother David, and it was a letter of love and also of guilt, written with the particular care of someone who is telling the truth about something they have been not quite telling the truth about. David Fairchild was writing to say that he had been in contact with Chester Pratt's representatives had been, for 2 months, in conversation about the possibility of selling his inherited interest in the ranch property, which was real though he had never exercised it, which Lillian had not known, because Thomas Fairchild's will had been structured to give Lillian operational control while preserving David's minority share. David was not selling. He had decided not to sell. That was the other thing the letter said, prominently and with apparent sincerity. He had decided he could not do it, that it was Lillian's home and her life, and he had no right to put it at risk for money he did not need. But he had been talking to them, and they had known about his share, and they had not told Lillian. They knew, she said. Her voice was very controlled. They knew he had a share in it, and they were working around me. All of this, all of it, and they were talking to David, trying to get access that way. He did not sell, Clayton said. He did not sell. She was quiet for a moment. He says he is sorry. He says he should have told me about the conversations immediately. She looked out at the dark. He probably should have. He came through, Clayton said. He came through in the end. Her voice was carefully neutral about the distinction. He sat down in the other porch chair, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her arm, which he did not yet, because the air between them felt like something that needed to be moved through carefully. "Are you all right?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. She was quiet for long enough that the coyotes started up somewhere to the south, their voices carrying sharp and clear through the cold air. "I am always all right," she said at last, and it was said without irony but also without complete confidence, in the voice of someone saying a thing they have said so many times it has become a kind of armor they are suddenly aware of wearing. "You do not have to be," he said. "Not tonight." She looked at him. The lantern light made her face golden and her eyes were very gray. Something was happening in them, not tears, not quite, but the particular emotion that lives just next to tears in people who do not let themselves have them often. "I am so tired," she said, and it was not the tired of not enough sleep. It was the tired of years of holding everything, of being the one who stayed, of fighting alone for something that mattered more than she had ever quite been able to explain to anyone. "I know," he said. "You cannot possibly, not the same way you know it," he said. "But I know enough to understand what it has cost you, and I know it should not have had to cost you so much alone." She looked at him for a long moment. Something passed across her face, the recognition, perhaps, that she was sitting in the dark on a November porch with a man who had ridden 4 days to be there and had spent 6 weeks understanding what she had built here, and who was looking at her the way no one had looked at her in a very long time. "Clayton," she said. "Yes." She did not say anything else. She did not have to. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, not grasped it, not held it, just placed his hand over hers on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand over and her fingers closed around his. And they sat like that in the dark and the cold, with the coyotes singing somewhere to the south and the lantern burning low. And it was the most honest thing either of them had done in as long as they could remember. The trial began on the 14th of November in the federal court at the county seat. It attracted attention far beyond what a land rights case might normally have generated, which Clayton had anticipated and quietly facilitated. There was a correspondent from the San Antonio Express in attendance, and one from a Fort Worth paper, because he understood that Chester Pratt's strongest protection had always been the privacy of his methods, and that sunlight was the most effective legal tool he had. The judge was a federal magistrate named Holloway, who had the reputation of being extremely disinclined toward theater, but deeply interested in documented evidence, which suited Clayton's approach precisely. He presented the Hendricks survey fraud first, the fabricated error, laid beside the original survey records from Austin with the neat, irrefutable clarity of a man who has spent 6 weeks organizing 6 years' worth of evidence. He presented the false water assessment against the Kavanaughs through documentation rather than testimony, which protected Elias from retaliation while still entering the pattern into the record. He called Rosa Vasquez, who testified with quiet, absolute precision about what Pratt's agent had said to her and her husband when he came to discuss a sale, the specific language used, the implied threats, the suggestion that certain things might become difficult for families who chose to hold out. She spoke in English, and then, when asked to clarify a phrase in Spanish, and the court interpreter repeated it, and the reporter from San Antonio wrote it down. Chester Pratt's lawyer, a man named Kellaway who had come up from Houston, was competent and aggressive and had clearly prepared for a fight. He cross-examined Rosa Vasquez with the careful pressure of someone looking for inconsistency. He found none. Lillian sat in the courtroom throughout, in the second row, in a dark wool dress that she wore with the same direct posture she wore everything. People in the gallery watched her. She did not watch them back. She watched the proceedings with the full attention of someone who had been studying for this test for years. When Kellaway moved to have the survey records excluded on a technical procedural ground, Clayton countered with a federal statute that Kellaway had apparently not expected him to know, and there was a brief, precise legal argument that the judge resolved in Clayton's favor with the air of a man who had found something professionally satisfying about the interaction. In the afternoon of the second day, Chester Pratt himself took the stand. He was, as Clayton had anticipated, an excellent witness for himself, composed, articulate, and practiced at making reasonable things out of unreasonable ones. He acknowledged the land acquisitions. He had an explanation for each of them. The explanations were not implausible, but Clayton had been waiting. On the cross-examination, he produced a letter. It was a letter from Pratt to Dahlen, written in October of 1881, before the drought's worst effects had hit, before any of the acquisitions had occurred. In the letter, Pratt outlined a strategy for acquiring the spring-fed properties along the Pecos tributary. Specifically, the Fairchild Spring, the method of accessing the water rights through easement language that the property owners would not understand without legal counsel, specifically, the advantage to be taken of drought conditions that he predicted were coming. The letter did not describe anything illegal in those exact terms. What it described was a plan, a deliberate, foreknowing plan, written before the events that had looked like responsive business opportunity were actually opportunity that had been manufactured. Judge Whitmore had found the letter. He had not told Clayton exactly how he had come by it. Clayton had not asked. Pratt, on the stand, recognized the letter. His composure did not break entirely, but it shifted a subtle recalibration, the expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life controlling how he appears and is now doing it under conditions that require considerably more effort. "Is this your letter, Mr. Pratt?" Clayton asked. "It appears to be." Is that your signature? It appears to be. In this letter, dated October the 3rd, 1881, you instruct your agent Dahlin to, and I am quoting directly, ensure the easement language in all offers is structured so that the full implications of the water access clause are not apparent to a non-legal reader. Is that correct? A pause. That is what is written there. Would you describe that, Clayton said, still pleasant, still entirely controlled, as a fair and transparent business practice? Kellaway objected. The judge overruled him and asked Pratt to answer. Chester Pratt looked at the courtroom. He looked at the reporter from San Antonio. He looked at Lillian Fairchild in the second row, who was looking back at him with an expression that contained no triumph, just the steady, clear-eyed patience of someone who has known the truth for a long time and has waited for the room to catch up. I believed it was within legal bounds, Pratt said. Within legal bounds, Clayton repeated. And the Hendricks survey error. The rest of that afternoon was systematic and methodical, and by the time Clayton finished, Judge Holloway had what he needed. He ruled on the 22nd of November, and his ruling was precise and comprehensive. The acquisitions of the Hendricks and Kavanaugh properties were voided on the basis of fraudulent misrepresentation. The false easement claim against the Fairchild Spring property was dismissed. Chester Pratt was ordered to pay substantial damages to the Hendricks and Kavanaugh families. The case was referred to the federal attorney's office for review of potential criminal fraud charges, which the judge noted he found the evidence more than sufficient to warrant. Dusty Creek, Texas, heard about it in layers, the way small towns receive large news in pieces, each one confirming and expanding the last, until by evening the full shape of it was known. Lillian was standing outside the courthouse when the ruling was read, and Clayton found her there when he came out with his leather satchel and the particular expression of a man who has done the thing he came to do. She was looking at the November sky, which was vast and cold and utterly clear. "It is over," he said. "Most of it," she said. She meant the Hendricks and Kavanaugh families, returning to land that was now technically theirs again, but after months of hardship, months of loss that legal victory could reverse on paper but could not fully repair in fact. The weight of that was still there in her voice. "Not everything can be made right," he said, "but what could be done has been done." She turned to look at him. The courthouse steps were busy with people coming out. The reporter from San Antonio moving toward Pratt's lawyer with a notebook open. Neighbors she knew stopping to speak to her, to touch her arm, to say things that required her to respond with the dignified grace she had always managed because it was who she was. But for just a moment, between all of that, she looked at Clayton Blackwell with the full weight of 6 weeks of working beside him and two people slowly, honestly, finding that the other person was necessary in a way that had crept up on both of them before either had been willing to name it. "What happens now?" she asked. It was not purely a practical question. "That depends," he said, "on what you want." "I want the Hendricks family to be able to go home," she said. "I want Rosa Vasquez to know that her testimony mattered." She paused. "I want to go home and make coffee and sit on the porch and not be thinking about Chester Pratt for the first time in 6 weeks. "All of those things can happen," he said. And after that, he met her eyes. "I was thinking," he said, "that I might stay in Dusty Creek a while longer." "There is no more legal work," she said. "That is not why I would stay." She looked at him steadily. "I am still not easy," she said. "I know. I will still argue with you. I count on it. I do not need." "I know you do not need me," he said quietly. "That is not what I am offering. I am not offering help or management or any of the things that people have been offering you since your father died. I am offering," he paused, looking for the exact right word because it mattered to get it right, "companionship, freely given, no management involved." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are very strange," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I mean that as a compliment." "I know you do." She almost smiled. This time it made it all the way. Not wide, not performed, just a real smile that reached her eyes and changed everything about her face in the best possible way. "Come on then," she said. "I will make the coffee." December in Dusty Creek was cold and bright and full of small recoveries. The Hendricks family began the process of returning to their land, which required help from the community in the practical sense: fencing that had not been maintained, stock that had been sold off. Lillian organized the help. She did it the way she did everything, with the direct efficiency of someone who knows what needs doing and how to bring people together around it. Clayton stayed. He set up a proper law office in the unused back room of the land office, because it became clear, within about a week of the trial's conclusion, that there were approximately 7 other situations in Crockett County and the surrounding counties that needed someone with both the legal knowledge and the willingness to use it in the service of people who were not Chester Pratt. He stayed because there was real work. He also stayed because every evening he was not actively needed elsewhere. He found himself at the ranch, or Lillian found herself at his office, and they talked in the way they had been talking since the beginning, about everything, about nothing, about the law and the land and the history they were moving through and what it meant and what it required. He had kissed her for the first time on a December evening on the porch in the cold, when they had been talking about something completely unrelated, the spring, and whether it would need shoring up along the bank where the last flood had undercut it. And he had turned to look at her when she said something precise and funny, and she had been looking at him already, and the 2 or 3 inches between them had simply stopped being 2 or 3 inches. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was a quiet one, which was exactly what it was supposed to be: 2 people who had been circling the center of something for weeks finally arriving there and finding it exactly as substantial as they had suspected. She pulled back just enough to look at him. "Was that?" he started. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that arrived when you have not expected to be this happy this soon. She was watching it with the expression of someone who has made a discovery they are going to need time to fully understand. "Lillian," he said. "I know," she said, and then, because she was who she was, "do not make it into a speech." He laughed. She looked at him, laughing for a moment, and then she laughed too, and it was the best laugh she had had in longer than she could name. January and February brought the particular deep quiet of a Texas winter, cold and clear. And into that quiet the relationship between Lillian Fairchild and Clayton Blackwell became something that both of them had, in their separate ways, stopped believing was possible for them. It was not simple. Lillian had spent enough years in her own company, making her own decisions, that shared life required active negotiation in ways that were occasionally vigorous. She had opinions about everything and expressed them without apology. Clayton had his own particular stubbornnesses, mostly around work, a tendency to take on more than was sustainable, a lawyer's instinct to find a way to argue for everything. And Lillian was the only person he had met in years who could argue back with the same stamina and precision, and who was entirely willing to tell him when he was wrong. They argued about the bank note she had taken the previous spring to get through a difficult month, and whether the interest rate was legally defensible. She was right that it was not. He was right that she should have told him about it sooner so he could address it. They were both right, and they both knew it, and the argument ended with a kind of mutual acknowledging nod that was, in its way, more intimate than most expressions of affection. They argued about her fence on the western boundary, where her land met Old Murphy's land, and whether the survey line had shifted. Clayton did not know enough about physical surveying to be right about this. She knew more than he did and was right about it, and he conceded with the clean directness of a man who has no investment in being right for its own sake, which she had never once encountered in any man before, and which she found, every time, both startling and deeply appealing. Hester Kane watched all of this with the satisfied expression of someone whose read of a situation has been entirely vindicated. By the time the cottonwoods along the spring were budding out in April, they had been courting, if that was the right word for 2 people in their late 20s who had skipped several of the more performative courtship conventions in favor of 6 weeks of working alongside each other through a legal crisis, for 5 months, and the question of what came next was in the air between them. He asked her on a Saturday afternoon in late April at the spring, where they had ridden as they often did on days when neither of them had pressing work, in the way that some places become yours together as a couple without you ever quite deciding it. He did not make it a speech. She had told him not to make things into speeches, and he had learned her well enough to know that directness was the only form of sentiment that she fully trusted, not because she was cold, but because she had been talked at rather than talked to for enough years that she needed the real words rather than the shaped ones. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I am asking because I want to, not because I think you need it, and not because I have any intention of trying to run anything that is yours." She was sitting on the limestone shelf above the spring pool, looking at the water, and she was quiet for long enough that a different man might have become anxious. He was not anxious, because he had been paying attention for 5 months, and he knew that this was how she processed things that mattered. She gave them the full weight of her consideration. "I have thought about it," she said at last. "I thought you might have." She looked at him. "You are very certain I would say yes?" "No," he said. "I am certain it is the right question." "The answer is yours." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. He smiled. She smiled back, and this time it was wide and immediate and unguarded in a way that he had seen grow more available over 5 months, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life being the reason for. They were married in June of 1884 in the church in Dusty Creek, which was too small for everyone who came, but which everyone came to anyway, filling the space beyond practical capacity, with the cheerful disregard of people who have decided that this is exactly the kind of event that the inconvenience is worth. Hester Kane was in the front row, and did not attempt to hide the fact that she was crying. Rosa Vasquez and her husband were there, and the Hendricks family, who had returned to their land and begun the long work of rebuilding. Judge Whitmore had made the journey from Abilene, which touched Clayton more than he was immediately able to express, and the judge shook his hand before the ceremony with the expression of a man who has been entirely right about something and is quietly very pleased about it. Lillian wore a dress of dark blue, not white, which was a choice that Dusty Creek discussed for approximately 3 days and then accepted, because it was Lillian Fairchild, and the dress was beautiful and matched her eyes, and she wore it with the exact same grounded certainty she wore everything else. She walked herself down the aisle, because her brother David had not been able to make the journey in time. He had tried, had sent a letter that arrived the week before the wedding with his love and his apologies, and a gift of real substance, a land survey instrument of good quality that he knew she would use. And she walked without hesitation or visible sentiment, which was not because she did not feel it, but because she felt it so completely that it was inside her rather than on the surface. Clayton, watching her come toward him, had an expression that Hester Kane later said was the most complete look of straightforward love she had ever seen on a man's face, nothing performed about it, nothing held back. The minister read the words. They said the words. Clayton's voice was steady. Lillian's voice was steady. When it was done, they stood face to face in the small church with the June light through the windows and the full weight of everything they had come through between them and ahead of them, and she said, quietly, so only he could hear, "I am glad you came." "I am very glad I came," he said. And they kissed, and the church made the particular noise that churches make when everyone in them is genuinely happy, which is one of the best sounds there is. The summer that followed was the kind that becomes the fixed point of reference for everything after. The drought was officially over. The spring of 1884 had brought rain, actual meaningful rain, and the grass was high and the cattle were gaining, and the spring ran strong and clear through the limestone. Clayton had 4 ongoing cases in Crockett County and 2 in the neighboring county, all of them in favor of small landowners, and he worked them from the law office while Lillian ran the ranch, and they met in the evenings on the porch or in the kitchen with the particular case of 2 people who have stopped performing for each other and are simply, reliably together. They disagreed about things. about money management regularly, because Lillian had a deeply conservative accounting instinct born of years of managing a loan, and Clayton had a lawyer's professional optimism about payment timelines that she found unrealistic. About the best approach to the Western fence situation, which remained unresolved. About whether a particular horse he was considering purchasing was worth the price, which it turned out was not. She had been right, as he acknowledged freely. They also laughed, more than either of them had in years. They laughed at the particular comedy of the law, which is endless, at the comedy of cattle, which is also substantial, at themselves, at each other, with the ease of two people who have agreed, without ever quite saying so, that laughter is one of the most important things. In October of 1884, Lillian told him she was expecting their first child, in the fall evening kitchen with the lantern lit and the coffee on, in the same direct, unadorned way she told him everything. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is very full rather than empty, and then he stood up and took her face in his hands and said something he had said before in various forms but which she had never stopped being moved by, which was simply, "I am so glad it is you." Their son was born in June of 1885, and they named him Thomas, after her father, which felt right in a way that was not about obligation, but about love continuing forward in time. He arrived in the world with Lillian's determined expression and Clayton's dark eyes, and a set of opinions about most things that were evident from very early on. The ranch prospered in the years that followed. The legal challenges Pratt's fraud had catalyzed produced lasting changes in how land transactions were handled in Crockett County recording requirements, the presence of independent witnesses, documentation standards that made the kind of casual paper fraud Pratt had practiced significantly more difficult. Clayton did not take credit for this. He pointed to the work of the community, to Lillian's years of record reading before he arrived, to Rosa Vasquez's testimony, to the Hendricks family going back to their land and insisting on it, to the neighbors who had supported one another through the hard years. Chester Pratt, facing the federal fraud review and the civil damages, settled out of court for a sum that was significant and sold his Crockett County holdings. He moved to San Antonio, where he presumably applied his considerable organizational capacities to enterprises that were somewhat less legally adventurous. The properties he had held reverted through various legal mechanisms to forms of community ownership and honest sale. The Kavanaugh family received their damages and were able to start again, though not on the original land. The Hendricks family rebuilt. It was not perfect justice. Perfect justice would have given back the months of hardship, the disrupted lives, the choices made under duress that could not be unmade. But it was real justice, and it was documented, and it set precedent that protected people who came after. Lillian knew this. She held it in the same way she held everything, not lightly, not heavily, but with the precise weight it deserved. Thomas was 2 years old when their second child came, a daughter they named Margaret, after Lillian's mother, who arrived with her father's steady temperament and her mother's eyes, and a determination to make her opinions known that seemed, in the opinion of the Dusty Creek community, to be entirely appropriate given the family. Clayton had a memory, he held it privately, did not often speak it, but held it as one of the fixed true things of an evening that first winter, before the trial, when he had ridden out to the spring alone in the early dark to think through a point of law. He had sat on the limestone shelf above the pool and heard her before he saw her the sound of a horse on the cold ground, and she had come over the rise and seen him there and not been particularly surprised, because she had figured out by then where he went when he needed to think. She had sat beside him on the limestone shelf. They had not talked for a while. The stars were extraordinary in the way that Texas stars are when the air is cold and clear. "Why are you really here?" She had asked eventually, and it was the question she had asked at the beginning but different now, not suspicious, not challenging, but the genuine curiosity of someone who had begun to care about the answer. Told you, he said. You told me what Judge Whitmore asked. That is not the same. He thought about it. I needed to do something that mattered, he said at last. In Kansas City, I was very competent and very comfortable, and I went home every evening to a room above a law office, and I understood very clearly that I was helping people with things that were real but not, he paused. Not necessary. Not in the way this is necessary. And this is people's lives, he said. Their homes. The thing they built or inherited or fought for. The thing that is theirs. He paused again. And there was nobody coming. There should have been someone coming, and there was nobody, and that seemed to me like something I could change. She had been quiet for a long moment. Someone came eventually, she said, later than they should have. Yes, she agreed, but they came. He thought about that memory on the evening of their 3rd anniversary, sitting on the porch of the ranch house with June dark around them, and the sound of Thomas, inside demanding something from the cook in the imperious tone of a 2-year-old, and Lillian beside him with a cup of coffee and the small private smile that had become, over 3 years, as familiar to him as his own hands. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The spring," he said. "That first winter when you came out and found me there." She remembered. He could tell by the way her expression shifted, not much because she was who she was, but enough. "You were thinking about the Hendricks survey records," she said. "I was also thinking about you," he said. "I had been for a while by then." "I know," she said. "You knew." "I am not unobservant," he laughed. She looked at him with the smile that had once been rare and was now the most natural thing in the world. "You are going to be insufferable about having known first," he said. "Probably," she said. "Yes." He reached over and took her hand, because it was what he did and what she allowed, because she had, over 3 years of marriage, discovered that she actively wanted it, which was one of the many things she had discovered about herself in the context of a life that was fully, genuinely shared with another person, rather than held entirely alone. The summer of 1887 brought good rain and a cattle price that was the best in 5 years, and they expanded the herd by 40 head and repaired the east fence properly, and finally resolved the western boundary survey dispute, which turned out to have been entirely in their favor. Clayton won a case that created precedent for water rights documentation in 3 counties that was cited in subsequent cases for a decade. Lillian served 2 terms on the newly formed Crockett County Agricultural Board, the first woman to do so, and managed the experience with the direct, informed competence that characterized everything she did, which meant that the people who had been skeptical about the appointment were eventually simply embarrassed about their skepticism. Thomas started school and came home with strong opinions about mathematics and an extensive collection of interesting rocks, both of which traits appeared to have arrived from both parents simultaneously. Margaret learned to ride earlier than anyone expected, and with more authority than was technically advisable for someone her size, which surprised no one. David Fairchild came to visit in the autumn of 1887 with his wife Eleanor and their 2 children, making the journey from Philadelphia that he had promised to make since the wedding. He was older than Lillian remembered, they all were, and he stood on the porch of the house he had grown up in with his father and looked out at the land with an expression that was complicated and genuine, the expression of someone understanding the full dimensions of a choice they made long ago. "You made it something," he said to Lillian. "It was already something," she said. "I just kept it." He looked at Clayton then, at Clayton and Lillian standing together in the way that people stand who have been side by side through enough things that it has become the natural position, and he said, with the simple directness of a man acknowledging what he is seeing, "I am glad you came." "So am I," Clayton said. Eleanor and Lillian took to each other after an initial cautious period that resolved, to everyone's relief, into genuine liking. Eleanor was a woman of the city with strong opinions about literature, and Lillian had read considerably more than most people assumed she had, and they spent several evenings in engaged argument about things that had nothing to do with cattle or law, which Clayton and David watched with the mutual appreciation of 2 men who have found themselves with women who are fully as interesting as they are. The visit lasted 3 weeks and ended with promises to return that were kept, because David Fairchild had decided that his sister's life was something he did not want to continue knowing from a distance. In the spring of 1889, Lillian came to Clayton in his law office on a Tuesday morning when he was reviewing a contract for a family in the next county, and she sat across from him with the particular directness of someone who has something to say and intends to say it without preamble. "There is going to be a third child," she said. He set down the contract. He looked at her. He said, "When?" "December, I think." He came around the desk and sat on the edge of it, close enough to take her hand, and she let him. And they stayed like that for a moment, the two of them, in the small law office in Dusty Creek, Texas, with the April light coming through the window and their life around them in all its full, complicated, entirely theirs together shape. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. And this time, unlike the first time he had asked her something like that, it was entirely simply true. Their third child, another son, arrived in December of 1889, and they named him Harlan, for the judge who had written a letter that had brought Clayton to Texas, and by the particular logic of things that matter, to everything that followed. Judge Whitmore, when he received the letter telling him this, sat in his Abilene office for several minutes with an expression that his clerk described as uncharacteristic softness, and then wrote back a letter that was longer and more personal than his correspondence usually ran, and which Clayton and Lillian both read twice. The years ran forward with the feeling of good years, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary struggles of land and weather and children, and the particular negotiations of two strong people sharing a life, but with the texture of something genuinely lived rather than endured. Lillian was 35 when Harlan started walking, and she stood in the kitchen and watched him navigate the unfamiliar physics of being upright with the same calm attention she gave to everything. And Clayton came in from outside and stood in the doorway and watched them both, and the particular quality of that moment, ordinary, domestic, absolutely full, was something he filed in the same place he had filed the spring, and the courthouse steps, and the porch on the December night she had said she was tired. And the December night 3 years later she had told him about Harlan, and all the other moments that were the actual substance of a life rather than its frame. "He is going to be stubborn," Lillian said, watching Harlan fall and get up for the 4th time. "He comes by it honestly," Clayton said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "From which side?" "I decline to answer on the grounds that I need to continue living here," she laughed. And he crossed the kitchen and stood beside her, and they watched their youngest son conduct his experiments in gravity with the shared attention of two people who are doing the most important thing either of them has ever done, and who know it. Dusty Creek changed over the years, as towns do. New families arrived. The railroad came closer, which brought things it brought and changed things it changed. The dry season of 1893 was harder than usual but not disastrous, because the legal work of the previous decade had established the water rights protections that kept the small ranches viable in a way they had not always been before. The Vasquez family prospered. The Hendricks family rebuilt fully and added land. The community that had been threatened by one man's systematic greed had become, through the combination of legal precedent and organized collective action, something more resilient than it had been before, not invulnerable, because nothing on the frontier was that, but connected in the specific way of people who have survived something together and know who was beside them when it mattered. Lillian kept the records. She had always kept records, but now she kept them in the organized, systematic way of someone who understood that what had nearly been lost was not just individual property, but the documented evidence of community, who was here, what they had built, what had been threatened and defended. She kept them in an office she had added to the ranch house, a small room with a good window and shelves along 2 walls, and she was in it most mornings for an hour with the particular quiet focus of someone doing important work. Clayton continued to practice law. He took cases throughout the county and the surrounding ones, never growing the practice into something that required a staff, because he had learned that the work he wanted to do required being close to the people he was doing it for, which was a practice quality that did not scale easily. He was not wealthy. They were comfortable, which was different and, in his opinion, better. On an evening in the autumn of 1895, they sat together on the porch as they had done 1,000 evenings, with the sounds of 3 children doing homework inside, and the smell of supper still in the air, and the cottonwoods along the spring visible as dark shapes against a last light sky. Thomas was 10. Margaret was 8. Harlan was 5. The house had the particular organized chaos of a house where children live with parents who both work at things that matter, and it was loud in the way that is full rather than empty, and it was exactly what both of them, in the separate loneliness of their separate former lives, had wanted without quite knowing how to name it. "I have been thinking," Lillian said. "About what?" "The deed records from the early 1870s. There are gaps in the county record for several land grants that I think need to be researched properly. Some families may have documentation issues that could become problems if anyone challenged them." "Lillian," he said, "it is important. It is 10 o'clock in the evening. I am aware of the time. Are you incapable of leaving important things until morning?" She turned to look at him. The lamplight from inside fell through the window across her face, and she was 37 years old, and she was the same person who had held a gun on 3 men in a land office 11 years ago. That was still there, the will and the clarity and the absolute refusal to be managed. And she was also someone who had built a life large enough to contain both work and love and children, and all the ordinary extraordinary accumulations of a full life actually lived. "Probably not," she said. "I know," he said. "It is one of the things I love about you." She looked at him for a moment with the expression that had started out as assessment and become something else entirely, the expression of a woman who has found, in a place she did not entirely expect to find it, the person who is simply right for her in the most complete sense of the phrase. "Come inside," she said. "I will show you what I found." He stood up and followed her in, and the door closed behind them, and the autumn dark settled around the ranch house with its lamplight in the windows and the sound of the family inside, and the spring ran cold and clear along the limestone at the eastern edge of the land that was hers and now also his and would one day be Thomas's, if he wanted it, or Margaret's, or Harlan's, or whoever of them loved it the way it deserved to be loved. It had been saved. It had been worth saving. And the man who had come to help had known, from the beginning, from the moment she had lowered the gun and looked at him across a room full of receding danger, that saving it was not about managing it or managing her, but about standing beside someone who was already fighting for the right thing and making sure the weight of it was not hers alone to carry. That was what he had come for. That was what he had done. And in the doing of it, without quite planning it, without quite deciding when exactly it happened, he had found the thing that had been missing from that comfortable office in Kansas City and from every careful year before Texas. The life that was genuinely, fully, irreversibly his, built alongside the most extraordinary person he had ever met, in the particular red and gold country of Crockett County, Texas, where the spring ran even through the drought. And the land remembered everyone who had stood on it and refused to give up, and the cottonwoods turned gold every autumn without fail, and would go on doing so for a very long time.